As the Constitution was passed to the states for ratification, the people in the country began to divide themselves into two major groups. You had those that were in favor of ratifying the Constitution, which became known as Federalists, and these generally were large supporters of the Constitution as it was written. They liked the balance of powers within the Constitution itself. They wanted a stronger national government. Most Federalists were wealthy people within the United States, whether they were planters and farmers or lawyers, craftspeople, but those that were from a very wealthy class. And some of your biggest Federalists and biggest supporters of the Constitution were those like Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, who is known as the father of the Constitution, George Washington, and also John Jay, right? These were very well-known Federalists who openly supported the Constitution. Then on the other side, you had what was known as the Anti-Federalists, right? And so these were the ones who opposed the Constitution as it was written. They were still very cautious of having too strong a national government. They thought it was going to be too powerful. And their biggest fear was the fact that the Constitution as it was written did not contain a Bill of Rights. Generally, most Anti-Federalists were small farmers and debtors, right? Definitely were those of the smaller class who were not as wealthy as Federalists. George Mason was a huge Anti-Federalist. Samuel Adams, Patrick Henry, these were all very well-known Anti-Federalists and very vocal about their opposition of the Constitution. As the Constitution went from state to state and the debate went on whether or not to ratify the document, some of the Federalists came together and created what's known as the Federalist Papers, right? And these were a series of essays written in support of the Constitution and giving all of the reasons as to why the Constitution was the best form of government. They were originally written anonymously. The authors we know were John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison. Each wrote a series of different essays, but they were all published under the name of Publius, which was actually in honor of a Roman leader back in the Roman Republic who believed in the idea of liberty and the Republic, and they thought that was a good name because it represented what they thought the Constitution would be. Eventually, the Federalist Papers would be collected together and created as a book, which would become very popular and sold very many copies as the Federalist Papers became very popular to read. But this definitely did a lot within the country to try and bring in more support for the ratification of the Constitution. Delaware was actually the first state to ratify the Constitution in 1787. As we mentioned before, right, only 9 states were needed technically in order to pass the Constitution and have it become the official document and the official rule body of law within the country. But it was very important that all 13 states really did ratify the Constitution because this was meant to unify the country. This was meant to be the rule book, right, essentially of how the government would run. So we really wanted all states to be on board. New York and Virginia, which were our largest populated states, had a large debate over ratification. And the delegates also knew that it was definitely important out of all of the states to have New York and Virginia on board because they were the 2 largest. Eventually, they both ratified the Constitution. Finally, in 1790, Rhode Island was the last state to officially ratify the Constitution, and then we had all 13 states officially ratify the Constitution. James Madison always argued that even though a Bill of Rights maybe would be needed and it would be essential for some of the delegates to be happy, he thought that the Constitution needed to be approved first as it was originally written, and only after could they then discuss a Bill of Rights. If they did a Bill of Rights, meanwhile, in between ratification, that means that some states would be signing a different document. So once all of the states ratified the Constitution and it officially became came into law, the Bill of Rights actually ended up being the first act of Congress. The Constitution was officially ratified in 1790 by the last state, and in 1791, the Bill of Rights was then passed by Congress as the first 10 amendments, and that became their first act of law. was to actually create the Bill of Rights, which then pleased all of those anti-federalists who feared the national government to be too strong. And so now we had a new rule book for the United States, and now we had the Constitution, which became the supreme law of the land.